Hello and thank you for joining me in this video. Today I'd like to talk about the ego, which is a concept understood from the social level, a concept which has been described by many philosophers and described in many philosophies, including the one from the East and the West. And of course, an ego as a concept very important in psychology and especially very important to psychoanalysis. So first of all, if we look at the very definition of the ego, we can see several different ones. We have the one which is described by the so-called social level or the common sense level, and it says that an ego is a person's sense of self-esteem or self-importance, and it is very similar to self-confidence, self-worth, self-respect, self-image, etc., etc. From the psychoanalysis, the ego is a very important part of the mind that mediates between the conscious and the unconscious and is responsible for reality testing and a sense of personal identity. So it is something that will mediate between your fantasies, your wishes and needs, and what is actually your responsibility in the world, what the reality actually is, which includes, of course, other people and the space they occupy. And the last definition relates simply to philosophy, and in this case, an ego is simply a conscious thinking subject. And all of this actually resonates with the original definition of the ego, which literally means I. I believe that the concept of the ego has been quite hijacked in our society. We usually think of an ego as something bad, something that makes a person quite narcissistic, grandiose, and very often quite egotistic and selfish as well. However, in the reality, the ego itself isn't something bad, isn't something that makes the person bad. Only in the case where the ego is unhealthy, then the person becomes also unhealthy and might exhibit all these negative traits that, other people don't really like, because that person will be too selfish and too inconsiderate towards other people. So if we think of the ego as something that all people possess, as something that allows us to mediate with the reality and actually face the reality as it is, then the strong ego would allow a person to actually face the reality as it is, which means that no matter what the truth is about themselves or about their current situation, they will have the energy or the power to actually face it instead of living in a denial or in a bias. In contrast, it would be the weak ego or very unhealthy ego that would make a person, very defensive, prone to lying, escaping truth, being easily offended, because their ego would be so weak that they are unable to face the truth. They are unable to face any contradictory evidence proving that they might be wrong, that they might be living in a denial, that they might be not as omnipotent or strong as they think they are. So what happens is that on one side we have that idea of a strong and healthy ego, and on the other hand we have that unhealthy and very weak ego, which kind of impairs the ability of a person to face the reality and mediate with other people. And if we look at the current Western society, many people would probably define it as, highly individualistic, ego-inflated, people valuing their ego more than the well-being of other people. And there's this problem concerning the idea of the ego as it is something bad, something that makes people very narcissistic. However, based on all definitions that I've described before, I believe that the problem isn't actually with having an inflated ego, but actually having a weak ego. Hence, people are very defensive when it comes to contradictory evidence, concerning their worldview. That's why they keep searching for various labels describing their identity, because they struggle with defining themselves. They struggle with a sense of self, which essentially points out to the fact that it is actually the weak ego that makes the person to engage compulsively in various behaviors that make them feel important, that make them feel stronger than they actually are. So the result of all that is a certain quality of narcissism, apathy towards other people, all these trolls, internet bullies, addiction to external validation, such as using Facebook and posting as many things as possible in order to get that approval from other people, and so on and on. So this again points to the problem of the ego, because if they had a strong ego, they wouldn't feel so insecure inside, and they wouldn't engage in a compulsive behavior to gain an approval of other people, especially through social media, as well as not having this urge to bully other people on the internet and display so much apathy towards what's going on, towards less fortunate people, etc., etc. And I believe this problem of the ego has been growing and growing for the past, decades, because the ego itself, since it is the conscious part of the mind and helps you to make decisions, helps you to navigate through the reality, it will form a certain attitude you have towards yourself and towards other people. So it is not really a problem that has been suddenly developed through your lifetime, but it is a problem that has been growing through the past generation, because it's not just a sense of self that relates to the ego itself, but a bunch of different values, social values, cultural values, such as in some families or in certain cultures, you will be met with a punishment if you are too assertive, if you are trying to be too independent, or if you are not helping others enough, or if you are helping too much, or perhaps if you're too nice towards other people, or maybe you are not nice enough. So, regardless of the choices you make, your parents, your family members will kind of shape you into the person by using these different punishments and rewards, which essentially influences your ego. But at the same time, it's not really their fault, because that's how they've been shaped by their parents, and their parents, and their parents, and grandparents, etc., etc. So again, this problem of the ego has been growing. What I mean by that exactly is what I've said on the beginning of the video, that we associate the concept of the ego with something bad, something very narcissistic, something selfish, and something very self-centered. Whereas in fact, as I've explained, the ego itself actually allows you to be more considerate towards other people, because having a strong ego makes you secure enough to mediate with that reality as it comes, instead of trying to escape it, instead of having, various coping mechanisms that pushes the reality away or pushes other people away, and so on and on. To use another example, in a similar manner, people adopting certain Eastern philosophies will interpret them as teaching people how to get rid of an ego, which is again a very big misconception. You cannot really get rid of the ego, because it would be the ego that is trying to get rid of itself. So again, it's a very big misconception. And what happens to people following these disciplines, following these teachings, and not being able to properly understand them, they very often end up very defensive, very aggressive. If you try to challenge the so-called very spiritual person, or someone involved with New Age, or someone involved with some other Eastern philosophies, they're usually one of the most aggressive people I've ever met, because they are so insecure inside, they are so invested into trying to get rid of the ego that they don't really see the whole hoax of getting rid of the ego by using the ego. And actually, in my opinion, Eastern philosophies actually teach to have a very secure ego, to have a very strong sense of self, because only then you can let go of yourself. You don't have to think constantly, oh, how can I get this validation? How can I get this approval? Or I've done something embarrassing, or I have to do this, I have to do that. If your ego is secure, you stop doing that because it's secure. So you don't really need to defend it. You don't really need to gain additional approval or validation in order to feel like you have it. And so I believe that Eastern philosophies actually teach you the strong and secure sense of self and having a strong ego, because only then you will be able to find this inner peace, and in turn your relationship with the reality itself and with the universe will be more unified, will be more secure. By having a strong ego and kind of letting go of yourself, you will be actually more capable on focusing on the reality around you, on the universe, what's going on with people, what's going on in the reality around you, etc., etc. Having a weak ego actually takes away this attention because you are so insecure that you have to constantly pay attention to yourself. So, as a short summary, the problem of the ego in our Western society, in our Western culture, doesn't involve having a too big ego or having an inflated ego or having an ego at all, but actually quite contrary. And most people will feel insecure about themselves, feel the need to defend themselves, feel the need to express themselves by attributing various labels to their personalities, to their identity, to their sexuality or gender. And all of these behaviors are a proof of a very weak ego, because if you have a weak ego, you have a need to actually grasp it. You have a need to make it more solid, to make it more apparent, to make it stronger, so that you don't have to feel that anxiety or insecurity ever again. And in contrast, if your ego is quite strong and secure, you don't really have to pay that much attention to yourself, because your ego is already secure. So you are able to then focus on the reality around you, on the universe, and on other people. And most importantly, your ability to face the truth, to search for the truth, whatever that is, will be much easier when having a secure and strong ego than having a weak ego, which constantly feels defensive, which constantly tries to prove its worth and its importance. So I hope you guys enjoyed it. If you have any thoughts you want to share or any questions, please don't hesitate to drop me a comment below, and I'll try to answer as soon as possible. Thanks for watching.